In the heart of the vast wilderness, a cabin stood, weathered and forlorn, its wood warped by decades of rain, snow, and silence. The dense forest loomed around it like a brooding army, the ancient pines whispering secrets to the wind. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time, left behind by the world, and steeped in an air of unease. Eric and Amanda were city dwellers, drawn to the cabin by an enticing online listing promising an escape from their hectic lives. The photos depicted a rustic charm, a crackling fireplace, a cozy interior, and serene surroundings. It was perfect for their anniversary getaway, or so they thought. As they drove deeper into the forest, the paved roads turned to gravel, then dirt, and eventually into a narrow, rutted trail that barely seemed fit for their car. The trees closed in, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that choked out the sunlight. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had fallen. It was smaller than the picture suggested, with broken shingles on the roof and windows clouded by grime. Amanda hesitated as she stepped out of the car, her unease growing. "It's quaint," she offered, forcing a smile. Eric chuckled nervously and grabbed their bags. "It's just for a few nights," he said. "Let's make the best of it." Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint, musty scent. The furniture was mismatched and threadbare, and the fireplace had long since gone cold. Eric fumbled with the light switch, but only a dim bulb in the corner flickered to life. They unpacked quickly, trying to ignore the creaks and groans of the old structure. That night, Amanda awoke to a sound, a faint scratching like nails against wood. She sat up, her heart pounding. Eric stirred beside her, groggy. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Listen," she whispered. The sound came again, louder this time, as if something or someone was at the door. Eric grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing except the dense wall of trees. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice wavered. "Go back to sleep." But sleep didn't come easily. The scratching continued intermittently, followed by faint thumps, as if something heavy was moving around outside. When dawn broke, they found deep gouges in the wood of the door. Amanda traced them with trembling fingers. "That's not from an animal," she said. Eric tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't hide his growing unease. Throughout the day, strange things kept happening. Objects seemed to move on their own. A coffee mug that Amanda distinctly remembered setting on the counter was suddenly on the floor. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, vanishing when they turned to look. The old radio in the corner crackled to life, spewing static before shutting off abruptly. As night fell, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. The forest outside seemed alive, with branches tapping against the windows like skeletal fingers. They decided to barricade the door and windows, pushing furniture against them. "Just to be safe," Eric said, though they both knew it was futile. In the dead of night, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. Then came the whispering, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Amanda clutched Eric's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, his face pale. The whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand, a language that sounded ancient and wrong. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Amanda fumbled for her phone, but it wouldn't turn on. The air grew icy, their breaths visible in the faint moonlight streaming through the cracks in the boards. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, and deafening against the silence. Eric grabbed a fireplace poker, his hands trembling. "Who's there?" he called, his voice breaking. There was no answer, only another knock, louder this time. Amanda sobbed, burying her face in her hands. The whispers surged, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. The cabin seemed to tremble, the walls groaning as if under some immense weight. The door burst open, splintering into pieces. A figure stood in the doorway, its form shrouded in darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that pierced the gloom. Eric swung the poker, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. The creature lunged, its shadowy appendages wrapping around him. His screams were cut short, replaced by a choking gurgle. Amanda ran, tripping over the overturned furniture. She scrambled out the back door into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at her as she ran. The whispers followed, now coming from every direction. She tripped and fell, the cold earth knocking the wind out of her. When she looked up, the figure was there, towering over her. Its face was a void. an abyss that seemed to pull her in. The next morning, the cabin stood silent once more, its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, there was no sign of Eric or Amanda, only the faint echo of whispers that faded with the rising sun. The forest reclaimed the cabin, its secrets buried deep among the trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitors.
Story number 2.
Beneath a moonless sky, a crooked sign marked the entrance to Deadwood Cabin. Unlike its idyllic name, the structure had a sinister reputation. Locals whispered that anyone who stayed there vanished, leaving behind only traces of their last moments. Still, the allure of an isolated escape lured 4 friends, Emma, Nate, Chloe, and Tyler, to rent it for a weekend. They laughed off the warnings as superstitions of a superstitious town. The drive there was long and winding, the road narrowing until it was little more than a dirt path swallowed by gnarled trees. The cabin emerged suddenly, a hulking shadow with cracked windows and warped planks. The air was colder here, and the forest was unnaturally quiet, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot as they approached. "Charming," Chloe said, her sarcasm not hiding her unease. Emma elbowed her playfully. "Come on, it's just old. Think of the stories this place could tell." That night, the group huddled around a small fire in the cabin's stone hearth. Shadows danced on the peeling walls as they traded ghost stories, each tale more absurd than the last. Nate was midway through his exaggerated impression of a ghostly wail when the room went silent. It wasn't laughter that stopped them. It was a sound, faint but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate creak, as though footsteps pressed against the ancient wooden floor above them. "Is there an attic?" Tyler asked, his voice low. Emma shook her head. "No. I checked the listing. Just 1 floor." Another creak followed, then another, growing closer. They exchanged nervous glances, each silently willing someone else to investigate. Finally, Nate grabbed a flashlight, his bravado faltering as he moved toward the source of the noise. The beam of light swept over the ceiling. There was nothing. No trapdoor, no crawl space. "Probably just the wind," he said, but as he turned back, the beam caught something, a smear of what looked like mud stretching along the ceiling beams. Emma gasped. "That's not mud," she whispered. It was red, fresh, and dripped slowly to the floor. Before they could react, the cabin plunged into darkness. The fire snuffed out as if an unseen hand had smothered it. Panic set in, and Chloe fumbled for her phone, but it wouldn't turn on. The oppressive silence was shattered by a deep, guttural sound, like the growl of a beast too large to exist. Emma clutched Tyler's arm, her breath coming in short gasps. "What the hell is that?" she hissed. None of them could answer. The growl turned into a raspy whisper, a language that sounded older than the earth itself. It came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around them like a tangible force. Nate screamed, pointing toward the far corner of the room. In the faint glow of the flashlight, they saw it. A figure, impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling. Its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in sharp, bony points that dragged against the floor. Its face, or lack of one, was a void, a black pit that seemed to draw all light and sound into it. "Run!" Chloe shrieked, bolting for the door. The others followed, but as they reached it, the door slammed shut, as if by an invisible force. The figure moved closer, its motions jerky, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. Tyler grabbed a chair and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, but as he climbed through, he froze mid-motion, his body stiffening unnaturally. His eyes widened in terror, and then he was yanked back into the room by unseen hands. His screams dissolved into gurgling silence. Emma and Chloe sobbed as Nate rammed the door with his shoulder, desperate to break it down. The whispers grew louder, and the cabin itself seemed to twist and contort, the walls bowing inward as if the structure was alive. Shadows stretched across the floor, grasping at their feet. When the door finally gave way, Emma and Chloe stumbled out into the forest. They ran blindly, the branches tearing at their clothes and skin. Behind them, the cabin loomed, its windows glowing with an unholy red light. Nate didn't follow, his cries cut short somewhere in the darkness. They didn't stop until they reached the car, panting and covered in blood, not all of it their own. The engine sputtered to life, and they sped down the dirt road, the cabin fading into the distance. Neither spoke a word until they reached the safety of the town. When they reported the events to the sheriff, he gave them a grim look. "Deadwood Cabin?" he asked, his voice heavy. "You're lucky to be alive. No one ever makes it out." The next morning, the sheriff and a search party ventured to the cabin. What they found was worse than they could have imagined. The structure was empty, devoid of any sign of Tyler or Nate. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols carved deep into the wood. The ceiling dripped with fresh blood, though no source could be found. The sheriff ordered the cabin boarded up, but the locals knew it wouldn't help. The evil in Deadwood wasn't confined to its walls. It was part of the land itself, waiting patiently for the next group of unwitting victims to stumble into its grasp.
Story number 3.
On a fog-drenched autumn evening, Sylvia drove alone down a winding country road, her old sedan the only moving thing for miles. Her GPS had betrayed her, spinning her in circles through a labyrinth of wooded backroads. She was headed to a weekend retreat, but hadn't seen a single sign of civilization for hours. As the last rays of sunlight bled into the horizon, she spotted a faint glow through the trees. A weathered sign loomed at the side of the road. Ashwood Inn. The place looked more like an abandoned manor than a hotel. Its peeling paint and crooked shutters gave it an air of neglect. Still, the warm glow from the windows offered the promise of shelter. Inside, the air was heavy, filled with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. The lobby was adorned with dusty furniture and oil paintings, whose subjects seemed to follow Sylvia with their hollow gazes. A bell sat on the front desk, tarnished but functional. She rang it, the chime echoing unnaturally long in the empty room. An elderly woman shuffled out from a back room, her face a mask of tired politeness. "Welcome to Ashwood Inn," she said in a whispery voice. "Looking for a room, dear?" Sylvia nodded. "Just for the night. My GPS sent me the wrong way, and—" She stopped when she noticed the woman's eyes. They were clouded, almost milky, but moved with an unsettling sharpness. "You've come to the right place," the woman said, sliding an ancient ledger across the counter. "Sign here." Sylvia hesitated, but exhaustion won out. The woman handed her a heavy brass key and gestured down a dim hallway. "Room 7, the woman murmured. "Sleep well." Sylvia carried her overnight bag to the room, the floorboards groaning beneath her every step. Room 7 was small and Spartan, with an iron-framed bed, a single chair, and a warped mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. She set her things down and tried to relax, but the room felt off. The air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. The mirror seemed to ripple when she passed by it, though she blamed it on her imagination. After a quick wash in the ensuite bathroom, she climbed into bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. And then came the knocking, a faint, rhythmic tapping just outside her door. She froze, her breath catching. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The knocking stopped. Heart pounding, she tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. She opened the door slightly, the hallway yawning before her, empty and silent. As she shut it and locked it tight, the mirror caught her eye. There, in its warped surface, was a figure, a tall, gaunt man standing directly behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her skin prickled with cold as the knocking started again, louder this time, but it wasn't the door, it was the window. Her room was on the second floor. The curtains billowed slightly, though the window was closed. Summoning her courage, Sylvia crept toward it, her hands trembling as she reached for the fabric. She yanked the curtain aside and her scream caught in her throat. A face pressed against the glass, pale, distorted, and grinning with teeth too sharp to be human. Its eyes were black pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. Sylvia stumbled back, her legs giving way as she hit the floor. The figure didn't move, its smile widening impossibly. The mirror cracked violently, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. Sylvia's reflection didn't mimic her terror. It stood still, staring back with a calm malice. Then it stepped out of the mirror. She scrambled backward, her screams filling the room as her own reflection, now fully independent, stalked toward her, its eyes hollow and leaking darkness. It tilted its head, studying her like prey. Behind it, the figure from the window was suddenly inside the room, towering over both of them. The last thing Sylvia saw was her reflection's hand reaching toward her, its fingers elongating into shadowy claws. The next morning, the elderly woman at the front desk shuffled into room 7 with her cleaning supplies. The bed was neatly made, the overnight bag gone, and the room as still as a graveyard. She sighed as she straightened the crooked mirror, murmuring, "Another one for the inn." Out in the woods, Sylvia's car sat abandoned, its doors locked and its GPS eerily silent. Somewhere deep inside the Ashwood Inn, her reflection still watched from the other side of the mirror, waiting patiently for the next guest.
Story number 4.
The storm began without warning, fierce winds ripping through the trees as lightning split the sky. Claire was already regretting her decision to take the back roads to her family's lake house. She'd been driving for hours, her phone's GPS useless in the patchy signal, when the rain grew so heavy she could barely see. That's when she spotted it. A cabin. Small and unassuming, its windows glowed faintly with a warm light. Relief washed over her as she pulled off the road, her tires sliding in the mud. She sprinted to the porch, hammering on the door. It swung open before her knuckles could make contact again. A man stood there, tall and wiry, his face shadowed in the dim light. His expression was calm, his voice even. "Lost, are you?" Claire nodded, breathless. "The storm. I can't drive in this. Can I just wait here until it clears?" He stared at her for a moment too long before stepping aside. "Come in." The cabin was sparse but clean, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke. A single lamp illuminated a small sitting area. A fire crackled in the hearth, though Claire hadn't seen smoke from the chimney when she'd arrived. The man gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit. Warm yourself." "Thank you," Claire said, sinking into the chair. "I'm Claire, by the way." The man didn't reply. He disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, returning with a steaming mug. "Tea," he said, handing it to her. His eyes, dark and unblinking, lingered on her face. She smiled uneasily and took a sip. It was bitter, almost metallic, but she swallowed it politely. "Do you live out here alone?" she asked. He sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly. "I do now." The fire popped loudly, making her jump. She laughed nervously. "Sorry, I'm a little on edge. Long drive." The man tilted his head, his gaze unrelenting. "You shouldn't have come." Her stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" He leaned forward. "It's not safe here." Claire set the mug down, her hands trembling. "I don't understand." "They don't like visitors," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who doesn't?" she asked, her chest tightening. As if in answer, the fire flickered violently and the room plunged into near darkness. The man shot to his feet, his face twisted with fear. "You need to leave, now." Claire's heart raced. But the storm. "They're here." A sound cut through the cabin, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Claire whipped her head around, her eyes searching the dim room. The man grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Go, get in your car and drive. Don't stop, no matter what." The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something scraping against the walls. The man pushed her toward the door, his movements frantic. She hesitated, her instincts screaming to flee but her legs refusing to move. Then she saw it. A shadow peeled itself from the corner of the room, stretching and contorting as it took form. It was impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head brushing the ceiling. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to suck in all light. Eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly red in the center of the void. "Run," the man screamed, his voice cracking with terror. Claire bolted for the door, her mind numb with panic. As she crossed the threshold, she heard the man's screams, cut short by a sickening crunch. She stumbled into the storm, the rain blinding her as she scrambled into her car. The engine roared to life and she slammed the accelerator, the tires spinning in the mud before catching. In her rearview mirror, the cabin's faint glow disappeared into the darkness. But the road didn't feel right. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. Her headlights flickered, and for a brief moment she saw it standing in the middle of the road. The shadowy figure, taller and more grotesque than before, its eyes burning brighter. She screamed, swerving to avoid it, and the car spun out, slamming into a tree. When she woke, the storm had passed, and the sun was beginning to rise. Her car was totaled, its front crumpled against the trunk. But she was alive. Dazed, she stumbled onto the road, hoping to flag down help. That's when she saw the cabin again. It was impossible. She'd driven miles away. But there it was, the same warm glow in the windows. The door stood slightly ajar, beckoning. And this time, the growling started before she even stepped inside.
Story number 5.
The little town of Black Hollow had its secrets, and none was more whispered about than the Wailing Bridge. Spanning a dried-up riverbed at the edge of town, the bridge was abandoned decades ago after a string of mysterious disappearances. Locals said the bridge wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Yet, like every town legend, some dismissed it as nonsense. Ellie, a journalist fresh out of college, wasn't one of them. When her editor asked for a Halloween feature, she jumped at the chance to write about the bridge. Expose the truth, she thought, packing her recorder and flashlight before heading to Black Hollow. The bridge looked more derelict than she'd imagined. Its rotting wooden planks sagged under years of neglect, and vines twisted around the rusted railings. The sun was setting, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. Ellie's heart raced, but she chalked it up to excitement. She wanted a story, and she'd get one. She set up her recorder near the center of the bridge, speaking into it as the last rays of sunlight faded. It's said that the Wailing Bridge earned its name because of the screams people hear late at night. Some claim they're the voices of those who disappeared, warning others to stay away. As if on cue, a low moan rippled through the air. Ellie froze, clutching her flashlight. The sound seemed to rise from the empty riverbed below, growing louder, morphing into something that resembled sobbing. She leaned over the edge, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the shadows, but revealed nothing. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, though the air was still. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep guttural creak. Ellie turned her head toward the source and froze. The wooden planks behind her were shifting, twisting unnaturally as though the bridge were breathing. One by one, the boards began to rise and fall, a wave rippling toward her. Panic gripped her as she snatched up her recorder and backed away. Her foot hit something soft. She looked down and stifled a scream. A shoe, dirty, scuffed, and unmistakably old, lay discarded on the planks. She picked it up, her hands shaking. It was damp and smelled faintly of rot. Her flashlight flickered, and when it stabilized, she wasn't alone. A figure stood at the far end of the bridge, shrouded in shadow. It was tall and thin, its limbs too angular, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Ellie's voice caught in her throat as the figure took a step forward, the sound of its movements like bones snapping. "Who's there?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it let out a long, wailing cry, a sound so piercing it made Ellie's ears ache. Her legs moved before her mind could process, and she ran toward the other side of the bridge. But with each step, the planks seemed to stretch farther apart, the distance to safety growing impossibly long. The wailing grew louder, echoing inside her skull. She glanced back, and the figure was closer, its face now visible in the flickering beam of her flashlight. It had no eyes, only hollow pits, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. Its hands reached out, fingers elongated into sharp, talon-like points. Ellie screamed, her foot catching on a loose plank. She fell hard, her flashlight skittering out of reach. The shadows closed in as the figure loomed over her, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. Its mouth opened wider, the wailing intensifying, and then darkness. Ellie's car was found parked at the edge of the woods the next morning. Her recorder sat on the passenger seat, still running. The tape captured her final moments, her panicked breathing, the sound of the wailing, and a single whispered phrase, "Help me." The bridge was cordoned off after her disappearance, but that didn't stop the rumors. Some say her voice now joins the others, calling out from the Wailing Bridge. Others swear they've seen her flashlight flickering in the darkness, a warning to anyone foolish enough to linger. But most know better than to go near the bridge at all. After all, the wailing always grows louder when it senses fresh prey.
Story number 6.
The town of Ravenswood had always been quiet, its dense forests and fog-choked streets lending it an air of mystery. But everyone knew about the house on Hollow Hill. It was a place of whispered stories, of warnings to children not to wander too far. No one dared to go near it, except for Sam. Sam was a skeptic. Ghosts, curses, haunted houses, they were just stories to scare people, he thought. But when his friends dared him to spend a night in the house, he didn't hesitate. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a smug grin, Sam made his way to Hollow Hill as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was more decrepit than he'd imagined. Its windows were shattered, its roof sagging with age. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. The air felt colder here, heavier, but Sam brushed it off as his imagination. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, stepping inside. The floorboards groaned under his weight, and the stale scent of decay filled his nostrils. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, catching the beam of his flashlight. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional whisper of the wind slipping through the cracks. Sam set up his camera in the main hallway, pointing it toward the grand staircase. "All right, let's see what all the fuss is about," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. Hours passed. He wandered through the house, finding nothing but broken furniture and peeling wallpaper. His flashlight began to flicker, but he'd brought extra batteries. He was prepared. What he wasn't prepared for was the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from upstairs. Slow, deliberate. Sam froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello?" he called out. His voice seemed to die in the thick air. The footsteps stopped. Sam let out a nervous laugh. Probably just the old house settling, he told himself. He turned to head back to the main hall, but the flashlight caught something in its beam. A shadow that wasn't his. It darted across the wall, too fast, too fluid. Sam's breath quickened. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. No answer. He took a step back, bumping into a small table. The impact knocked over a cracked mirror, which hit the floor and shattered. The sound was deafening, and for a moment the house seemed to hold its breath. Then came the whispers. They were soft, indistinct, but they filled the air around him. Words he couldn't understand, spoken in voices that seemed to come from every direction. Sam spun in place, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of overlapping voices. Something moved at the top of the staircase. Sam's flashlight caught it, a figure standing just out of reach of the light. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly like embers in the dark. "Stay back!" Sam shouted, but the figure didn't move. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against his chest. Then the figure took a step forward. Sam stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly. He tripped over the shattered mirror and fell hard, the air rushing from his lungs. When he looked up, the figure was at the bottom of the stairs, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers returned, louder and more violent, as if they were inside Sam's own head. He screamed, scrambling to his feet and running for the door. The house didn't want him to leave. The walls seemed to shift, the hallway stretching endlessly. Doors that had been opened slammed shut, and the air grew colder with every step. Sam's flashlight finally gave out, plunging him into darkness. He reached out blindly, his fingers brushing against the rough wood of the front door. Relief flooded him as he yanked it open and stumbled outside. The cool night air hit his face, and he didn't stop running until he reached the bottom of the hill. When he finally looked back, the house was dark and silent, just as it had been before. But in one of the broken windows, he swore he saw the faint glow of eyes watching him. Sam didn't tell his friends what happened. He claimed the house was boring, uneventful, but he never went back, and he never slept soundly again. Sometimes in the dead of night, he'd hear whispers, soft and indistinct, just outside his bedroom door. And sometimes when he looked in the mirror, he swore there was someone standing behind him.
Story number 7.
Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, there was a road known only to locals as Deadman's Curve. It was a sharp, treacherous bend where countless accidents had occurred. The locals avoided it at all costs, especially after sunset, but outsiders often found themselves lured there by faulty GPS directions. Katie and Mark were two such outsiders, a young couple on a road trip. They'd been arguing over which route to take when their GPS insisted the shortest path was through the mountains. By the time they reached the winding road, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest shrouded in shadows. "Are you sure this is right?" Katie asked, clutching the armrest as their car climbed the narrow road. "It's what the GPS says," Mark replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It'll be fine." The air outside grew heavy with fog, and the trees closed in, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The headlights barely pierced the thick mist, and Katie's unease deepened. Then they saw her. A woman stood by the side of the road, drenched in the beam of their headlights. Her dress was old-fashioned, white and tattered, and her long, dark hair clung to her face. She wasn't moving, just staring straight ahead with a vacant expression. Mark slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" Katie leaned forward, her heart pounding. "We should help her. She could be hurt." Mark hesitated. "I don't know, Katie. She looks wrong." But Katie was already rolling down her window. "Are you okay?" she called out. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Katie felt a chill run down her spine, but she couldn't look away. There was something off about her face. It was pale, almost too pale, and her eyes seemed unnaturally dark. Mark reached over and grabbed Katie's arm. "We're leaving. Now." He hit the gas and the car lurched forward. Katie turned in her seat, watching the woman shrink into the distance. Then suddenly, she wasn't there anymore. The road was empty. "That was weird," Katie said, her voice shaky. "Weird doesn't cover it," Mark muttered, his eyes fixed on the road. "Let's just get out of here." They drove in tense silence for several minutes until the curve appeared, a sharp turn that came out of nowhere. Mark hit the brakes hard, the tires screeching as the car skidded dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. "Jesus!" Mark shouted, his heart racing. He maneuvered the car back onto the road, his hands trembling. That was close. Katie glanced behind them, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark, she's back." Mark looked in the rearview mirror. The woman stood in the middle of the road, her face illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. This time she was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across her face. "She's not human," Katie whispered, her voice barely audible. The car stalled. Mark twisted the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. The air grew colder, frost creeping across the windshield from the edges inward. Katie's breath fogged up as she clutched Mark's arm. The woman began to walk toward them, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow, and her smile widened as she approached the driver's side window. "Start the car!" Katie screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I'm trying!" Mark yelled, panic overtaking him. The woman reached the car, placing her hands on the driver's side window. Her fingers were long and clawed, her nails scraping against the glass. She leaned in, her face inches from Mark's, her mouth moving silently. Then the whispering started. It wasn't coming from her, it was everywhere, filling the car, seeping into their ears. Words they couldn't understand, words that made their heads ache and their hearts race. Mark slammed his fist on the dashboard. "Come on! Come on!" The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas. The car sped forward, throwing the woman back into the fog. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. They didn't stop driving until they reached the lights of a small town. They pulled into a gas station, both of them shaking. Mark got out to check the car, while Katie sat in the passenger seat, her head in her hands. That's when she saw it. Written in the fogged-up window beside her, in long, jagged letters, were the words, "See you soon."
Story number 8.
In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness stood a lodge known as the Shadow Pines Retreat. Once a thriving getaway for travelers seeking the northern lights, it had been abandoned for years, its reputation tarnished by the disappearance of its last owner, a man named Joseph Harrow. Locals claimed the lodge was cursed, its halls haunted by something far older than the building itself. Naomi didn't believe in curses. She was a documentary filmmaker, and the lodge was perfect for her latest project, uncovering the truth behind urban legends. Armed with cameras, recording equipment, and a week's worth of supplies, she arrived at the lodge just as a snowstorm began to blanket the landscape. The lodge was massive, its log walls weathered but sturdy. Naomi pushed open the heavy door, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The interior was eerily intact, as if the owners had left in a hurry. A layer of dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs stretched across the corners, but everything else seemed untouched. "This is going to be great," she whispered to herself, setting up her equipment in the main hall. The first night was uneventful, the only sounds the howling wind and the creaks of the old building settling. Naomi explored the lodge, filming every detail. She found guest rooms with unmade beds, a dining hall with plates still on the tables, and a grand staircase leading to the upper floors. But it was the basement door that caught her attention. It was bolted shut, the wood scarred with deep gouges as though someone or something had tried to claw its way out. "Definitely creepy," she muttered, filming the door. She tugged at the bolt, but it didn't budge. Tomorrow, she decided, already imagining the footage she'd get from whatever was down there. That night, Naomi was awakened by a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. She sat up in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. Probably just the wind, she told herself, grabbing her flashlight and camera. She followed the sound down the hallway, her breath hitching with every step. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural hum. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls. Naomi turned in a circle, her flashlight beam shaking. Then she saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, stretched across the wall at the end of the hallway. It moved unnaturally, its edges writhing like smoke. Naomi's flashlight flickered, and the shadow vanished. "Just my imagination," she whispered, but her voice trembled. The next morning, Naomi found footprints in the snow outside, large barefoot prints that circled the lodge and disappeared into the forest. She tried to convince herself they were from an animal, but the shape was distinctly human. Determined to push through, she decided to focus on the basement. Breaking the bolt with a hammer, she pried the door open. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying the stench of damp earth and decay. The basement stairs descended into pitch blackness, the beam of her flashlight swallowed by the oppressive dark. She hesitated. "Just another part of the story," she muttered, descending carefully. The basement was larger than she'd expected, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars of strange, preserved objects. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, its arms scarred with deep grooves. The floor around it was stained dark, and symbols were etched into the stone. Naomi's camera beeped, the battery suddenly dead. She cursed, pulling out her backup, but it too refused to power on. The air grew colder, and the hum she'd heard the night before began again, louder this time, vibrating through her chest. Then she heard it, a whisper, soft and insistent, coming from behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The whispering continued, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "Get out," they hissed. Naomi stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling together in the corner. Slowly, they took form. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes that glowed faintly red. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as it stepped forward, its movements disjointed, like a marionette on tangled strings. Naomi screamed, scrambling up the stairs. The whispers turned to wails, echoing through the lodge as she burst into the main hall. The front door wouldn't open, no matter how hard she pulled. The windows were frosted over, the snow outside impossibly deep. The wailing stopped abruptly. The lodge fell silent. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the basement stairs. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the doorway. The figure emerged, its grin impossibly wide. "You shouldn't have come," it rasped, its voice layered with dozens of others. Naomi's vision blurred as the air grew thick. Her knees buckled, and the last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the figure reaching out, its skeletal fingers inches from her face. A search team found Naomi's abandoned car weeks later, buried in snow. The lodge was empty, though her equipment was still set up in the main hall. The only clue was her camera, which contained hours of static and a single recording. In it, Naomi's voice could be heard whispering, "It's still here. Don't open the door." No one has dared to go back since. But sometimes, hikers claim to hear faint whispers near Hollow Hill, carried on the icy wind.
Story number 9.
There was a small, unassuming town in the Midwest where everyone avoided the train tracks after dark. The tracks were no longer in use, the trains long gone, but the legend of the midnight train persisted. They said that if you walked the tracks at midnight, you'd hear the whistle of a train that wasn't there, and if you stayed too long, it would come for you. Megan didn't believe in ghost stories. A photographer with a fascination for urban legends, she saw the midnight train as the perfect opportunity for her next project. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a digital recorder, she headed for the tracks just before midnight, the cold air biting at her skin. The tracks stretched endlessly into the darkness, overgrown with weeds and littered with rusted debris. Megan set up her tripod and adjusted her camera, her breath visible in the frigid air. The stillness was unnerving, but she told herself it was just the isolation. She checked her watch. 11:57 p.m. The first sound came at exactly midnight. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a distant whistle that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She paused, her hand hovering over her camera. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the low rumble of wheels on steel. But when Megan looked down the tracks, there was nothing but darkness. Her rational mind kicked in. "Probably just an echo," she muttered, clicking the shutter to capture the empty tracks. The air grew colder, and the whistle sounded again, closer this time. Megan's flashlight flickered as the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. She turned, expecting to see a train barreling toward her, but the tracks were still empty. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her recorder. "I'm standing on the tracks at midnight," she said, her voice trembling. "There's no train, but I can hear it. The ground is shaking." The recorder cut off with a sharp burst of static. Megan's flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her spare batteries, her hands shaking when the rumble grew deafening. The whistle blared again, this time so close it made her ears ring. Then she saw it. The train emerged from the darkness, its black steel gleaming under the pale moonlight. It was massive, its engine spewing smoke that hung low in the air. The windows of the train cars glowed faintly, casting an eerie light on the surrounding trees. But there was no sound of grinding wheels, no screech of metal, just the unearthly hum of its presence. Megan froze as the train screeched to a halt before her. The doors of the nearest car slid open with a hiss, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A cold, unnatural wind rushed out, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell. A voice called from the darkness, low and gravely, "All aboard." Megan stumbled backward, her camera forgotten. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, tears stinging her eyes. But the voice came again, louder this time. "All aboard." She turned to run, but the train whistle pierced the air, paralyzing her with fear. When she glanced back, shadowy figures began to emerge from the train cars. They were thin and gaunt, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky like broken puppets. They walked toward her in perfect unison, their feet never quite touching the ground. Megan's survival instincts kicked in, and she bolted into the woods. Branches whipped at her face and arms as she ran, the sound of the whistle and the shuffling figures growing fainter. Finally, she collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. The train tracks were nowhere in sight. She fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling, and turned on the flashlight. Her relief was short-lived. Carved into the bark of the tree in front of her were 3 words: "You're next." The whistle sounded again, closer this time. Megan turned, and her flashlight illuminated the hollow eyes of the shadowy figures, now standing just feet away. Their mouths opened in unison, emitting a deafening scream that swallowed the world in darkness. Megan's body was never found, but her camera was discovered by a local hiker months later, still sitting on its tripod by the tracks. The photos she'd taken showed nothing unusual, just empty tracks under a starless sky. But the last photo, taken at exactly 12:03 a.m., was different. It showed a black train, its windows glowing faintly, with a single figure standing in the doorway. It was Megan, her face pale and her eyes hollow, staring straight into the lens.
Story number 10.
The old cabin stood alone at the edge of the dense forest, its sagging roof and boarded windows a testament to decades of neglect. Locals whispered about it, calling it the Howling Hollow, a place where shadows seemed to breathe and the night stretched endlessly. Nobody dared to step inside after sunset, not since the disappearance of the Abbott family 20 years ago. Lena had heard all the stories. She didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but she did believe in uncovering the truth. As an investigative journalist, her job was to explore mysteries, and the Hollow was her latest assignment. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a tape recorder, she drove through the winding mountain road under a sky heavy with storm clouds. The cabin was more foreboding up close. The wood groaned as if alive when she pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with mildew, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered, a smell that made her stomach churn. Dust-covered furniture sat in awkward angles, as though hurriedly abandoned. Lena turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The first sign of something amiss came quickly. On the walls, scratched into the peeling paint, were words in uneven scrawls. "Leave. Turn back." She ran her fingers over them, the grooves too deep to be the work of a mere knife. Her flashlight flickered as she recorded her observations, and she froze when she heard a faint thud upstairs. "Probably an animal," she muttered, though her voice sounded hollow in the empty cabin. Still, her pulse quickened as she climbed the narrow staircase. Each creak of the steps seemed to echo, the sound too loud, too deliberate. The upper floor was worse. The hallway felt unnaturally long, stretching further than it had seemed from outside. A single door stood ajar at the end, and from within came a soft, rhythmic tapping. She hesitated but pressed on, her flashlight beam shaking. Inside the room, there was nothing but an old rocking chair, moving on its own. Lena's breath caught. She approached slowly, only to stop when her flashlight illuminated the floor around the chair. Symbols were carved into the wood, a circle with jagged runes that made her head ache just to look at them. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. The rocking chair stopped. The air turned icy, and a voice, low, guttural, and filled with malice, whispered her name. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart pounded as she fumbled with the door handle, which refused to budge. The voice grew louder, calling her again, this time with a venomous laugh. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, twisting and rising like smoke. They formed shapes, human-like but distorted, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that stared through her. The tape recorder in her pocket clicked on. Through the static, she heard something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just her name. The voice listed every detail of her life, secrets she had never spoken aloud. She screamed and threw her weight against the door. It finally gave way, and she tumbled into the hallway. But it wasn't the same hallway. The walls were alive now, pulsing and shifting, covered in what looked like veins. A wet, slithering sound followed her as she bolted down the stairs. When she reached the front door, it too refused to open. Desperation clawed at her as she pounded on the wood, screaming for help. Behind her, the shadows from the room began pouring down the stairs, faster than she could run. They reached her, and the last thing she felt was their icy grip pulling her into the floorboards. The cabin was silent again, except for the faint hum of the tape recorder. It lay in the grass outside, just beyond the threshold, playing back her screams for no one to hear. The next morning, the cabin appeared as it always did, silent, decrepit, and untouched. But if you listened closely, you might hear the faint sound of a rocking chair creaking or a voice whispering your name, daring you to enter.
Story number 11.
The forest was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that made Clara's skin prickle. Her friends had dared her to spend the night in the Widow's Watch, an isolated cabin deep in the woods. It was said that the place belonged to Evelyn Marrow, a reclusive widow who vanished without a trace decades ago. Some said she was murdered. Others whispered that she walked into the woods and never came back. The cabin loomed before her, a skeletal figure against the darkened sky. Its windows were like black, unblinking eyes, and the warped wood seemed to sigh as she approached. Clara's flashlight flickered as she opened the door. Inside, the air felt heavier, stifling. Dust motes hung like frozen stars in the weak beam of her light. The first hour passed uneventfully. Clara settled on the torn couch with her sleeping bag, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She had just begun scrolling through social media when she heard it. A faint knock. It wasn't from the door, but from somewhere deep within the house. Just the wind, she told herself, though the air was still and stagnant. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. She stood, her flashlight trembling, and followed the sound down a narrow hallway. The knocking stopped as she reached a closed door at the end of the hall. Her breath hitched as she noticed the doorknob was coated in something dark and sticky. Blood? No, it had to be rust. She wiped her hand on her jeans and opened the door. Inside was a small, empty bedroom with a single rocking chair facing the corner. It creaked back and forth, though there was no breeze to move it. Her flashlight flickered again, and she swore she saw the faint outline of a figure sitting in the chair. But when the light stabilized, the chair was empty. She backed out of the room and slammed the door. The sound of the knocking returned, now coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath her feet. She ran back to the living room, but the space had changed. The couch was gone, replaced by a long dining table set with dusty plates and silverware. On the far end of the table sat a figure cloaked in shadow. Clara froze, unable to look away as the figure slowly raised its head. Hollow sockets stared back at her, and the faint sound of whispering filled the room. Words she couldn't understand, but that made her stomach churn. She turned to run, but the front door was gone. The walls seemed to close in, the wood groaning as if alive. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced at the screen. A new message had appeared. "She's watching you." Her flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. Panic clawed at her as she felt a cold, bony hand brush against her arm. She screamed and bolted blindly, crashing into unseen furniture. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, and she realized they were saying her name. Suddenly, she tripped and fell hard onto a wooden floor. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the small bedroom. The rocking chair creaked softly, and then it stopped. A voice rasped behind her ear. "Leave? You're already mine." Clara turned, but there was nothing to see, only darkness that swallowed her whole. Her friends found her car the next morning, parked exactly where she'd left it. The cabin stood empty, quiet as always, but when they stepped inside to look for her, all they found was her flashlight, still warm to the touch. The locals said the cabin had claimed another soul. And now, on quiet nights, the sound of a faint knock echoes from the walls, a warning to anyone foolish enough to enter.